Hi everyone, this is Sarah from LAC, and today I am going to read the biography of George Washington, our first president.
Hi, my name is Lynette. I'm behind the camera.
Okay, so George Washington, born 1732 and he died at 1799. George Washington, a founding father of the United States, led the Constitutional Army to victory in the Revolutionary War and was America's first president. Who was George Washington? George Washington was a Virginia plantation owner who served as general and commander-in-chief of the colonial armies during American Revolutionary War, and later became the first president of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732 in Westmore County, Virginia. He was the eldest of Augustine and Mary's 6 children, all whom survived into adulthood. And this is a picture of our first president, George Washington. Mount Vernon. In 1735, Augustine moved the family up to Potomac River to another Washington family home, Little Huntington Creek Plantation, later renamed Mount Vernon. They moved again in 1738 to Ferry Farms on Rappahannock River, opposite of Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Washington spent most of his youth. Childhood and education. Little is known about Washington's childhood, which fostered many of the fables later biographies manufactured to fill in the gap. Among these are the stories that Washington threw a silver dollar across the Potomac, and after chopping down his father's prized cherry tree, he openly confessed to the crime. It is known that at the age of 7 to 15, Washington was homeschooled and studied with the local church's sexton, and later a schoolmaster in practical math, geographic, Latin, and English classic. But much of the knowledge he would use the rest of his life was through his acquaintance with woodsmen and plantation foremen. By his early teens, he mastered growing tobacco, stock raising, and surveying. Washington's father died when he was 11 and became the ward of his half-brother Lawrence, who gave him a good upbringing. Lawrence had inherited the family's Little Huntington Creek plantation and married Annie Fairfax, the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax of the well-to-do Fairfax family. And here's George Washington with his father at the cherry tree when he confesses to chopping down the cherry tree. And there's also George Washington as a young lad with his mother, Martha. I'm drawing a blank here. What's his mother's name again?
Was it Martha?
No, that's his wife. Mary.
Mary, okay.
With his mother, Mary.
Okay.
And there he is when he's a colonel with his mother, Mary, also. Mount Vernon, Washington would gradually increase his land holdings there about 8,000 acres. The pre-revolutionary military career. In the early 1750s, France and Britain were at peace. However, the French military had begun occupying much of Ohio Valley, protecting King's land interests, particularly fur trappers and French settlers. But the borderland of the area were unclear and prone to dispute between the two countries. Washington showed early signs of natural leadership, and shortly after Lawrence's death, Virginia Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie appointed Washington with a rank of major in Virginia militia. Oh, and then French and Indian War. On October 31st, 1753, Dinwiddie sent Washington to Fort Laboux at what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania, to warn the French to remove themselves from land claimed by Britain. The French politely refused, and Washington made a hasty ride back to Williamsburg, Virginia, colonial capital. Dinwiddie sent Washington back with troops, and they set up a post at Great Meadows. Washington's small force attacked a French post at Fort Duquesne, killing the commander and 9 others and taking the rest prisoners. The French and Indian War had begun. The French counterattacked and drove Washington and his men back to his post at Great Meadows, later named Fort Necessity. After a full day's siege, Washington surrendered and was soon released and returned to Williamsburg, promising not to build another fort on the Ohio River. And then here's Washington at the French and Indian War. Through a little embarrassing at the capture, he was grateful to receive the thanks from the House of Burgess and see his name mentioned in the London Gazettes. Washington was given the honorary rank of Colonel and joined British General Edward Braddock's army in Virginia in 1755. The British had devised a plan for the 3-pronged assault on French force attacking Fort Duquesne, Fort Niagara, and Crown Point. Excuse me. During the encounter, the French and their Indian allies ambushed Braddock, who was mortally wounded. Washington escaped injuries with 4 bullet holes in his cloak and 2 horses shot out from under him. Though he fought bravely, he could do little to turn back the rout and led the defeated army back to safety. And here we are. Commander of Virginia troops. In August 1755, Washington was made commander of all Virginia troops at the age of 23. He was sent to the frontier to patrol and protect nearly 400 miles of the border, with some 700 ill-disciplined colonial troops and a Virginia colonial legislator unwilling to support him. It was a frustrating assignment. His health failed in the closing months of 1757, and he was sent home with the dysentery. 58. Washington returned to duty on another expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. A friendly fire incident took place, killing 14 and wounding 26 of Washington's men. However, the British were able to score a major victory, capturing Fort Duquesne and control of the Ohio Valley. Washington retired for his Virginia retirement in December 1758. His experience during the war was generally frustrating, with key decisions made slowly, poor support from the colonial legislator, and poorly trained recruits. Washington applied for commission with the British Army but was turned down. In 1758, he resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. The same year, he entered politics and was elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses. Martha Washington. A month after leaving the army, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a widow who was only a few months older than him. Martha brought to the marriage a considerable fortune of 18,000 acres estate, from which Washington personally acquired 6,000 acres. With this and land he was granted for his military service. Washington became one of the more wealthy landowners in Virginia. The marriage also brought Martha's 2 young children, John, Jackie, and Martha, Patsy, ages 6 and 4. Washington's lavished great affection for both of them and was brokenhearted when Patsy died just before the Revolution. Jackie died during the Revolution, and Washington adopted 2 of his children. And here is his wife, Martha Washington.
Oh, she was beautiful.
Yes, she was. Enslaved people. During the retirement of the Virginia militia until the start of the Revolution, Washington devoted himself to the care and development of the land holdings, attending the rotation of crops, managing livestock, and keeping up with the latest scientific advances. But by the 1790s, Washington kept over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. He was said to dislike the institution of slavery, but accept the fact that it was legal. Washington, in his will, made his displeasure with slavery known, as he ordered that all his enslaved people be granted their freedom upon the death of his wife Martha. This act was generously, however, applied to fewer than half of Mount Vernon's enslaved people. Those enslaved people owned by the Cuttis family were given to Martha's grandchildren after his death. Washington loved the land gentry life of horseback riding, fox hunting, fishing, and cultivation. He worked 6 days a week, often taking off his coat and performing manual labor with his workers. He was an innovative and responsible landowner, breeding cattle and horses and tending to his fruit orchard. And then there's our president, first president, with his wife Martha. George Washington was also known for his wooden teeth. Much has been made of the fact that Washington used false teeth or dentures for most of his adult life. Indeed, Washington's correspondence to friends and family made frequent references to aching teeth, inflamed gums, and various dental woes. Washington had one tooth pulled when he was just 24 years old, and by the time of his inauguration in 1789, he had just one natural tooth left, but his false teeth were not made of wood, as some legends suggest. Instead, Washington's false teeth were fashioned from human teeth, including teeth from enslaved people and his own pulled teeth, animal teeth, and assorted metals. Washington's dental problem, according to some historians, probably impacted the shape of his face and may have contributed to his quite somber demeanor. During the Constitutional Convention, Washington addressed the gathering dignitaries only once. The American Revolution. Through the British proclaimed the Acts of 1763 prohibit a settlement behind the Alleghenies, irritated Washington, and he opposed the Stamp Act of 1765. He did not take a leading role in the growing colonial resistance against the British until the widespread protest of the Townshend Act in 1767. His letters of the period indicated he was totally opposed to the colonials declaring independence. However, by 1767, he wasn't opposed to resisting what he believed were fundamental violations by the Crown of the rights of Englishmen. After the passage of Coercive Acts in 1774, Washington chaired a meeting in which the Fairfax Resolve was adopted, calling for convening of the Constitutional Congress and the use of army resistance as a last resort. He was selected as a delegate to the first Constitutional Congress in March of 1775. Commander-in-Chief, the Continental Army. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the political dispute between Great Britain and her North American colonies escalated into an armed conflict. In May, Washington traveled to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia dressed in the military uniform, indicating that he was prepared for war. On June 15, he appointed Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the colonial forces against Great Britain. As was his custom, he did not seek out the office of commander, but he forced no serious competition. Washington was the best choice for the number of reasons. He had a prestige military experience and charisma for the job, and he had been advising Congress for months. Another factor was political. The revolution had started in New England, and at the time, they were the only colonies that had directly felt the brunt of British tyranny. Virginia was the largest British colony, and New England needed Southern colony support. And here's we go.
He's ready for battle, right?
He's ready for battle. From the looks of it, this looks like, what's that man? Paul Revere.
Oh, yeah.
There's Paul Revere.
Oh, wow.
That's the French one, right? Political considerations and forces of personally aside, Washington was not necessarily qualified to wage war on the world's most powerful nation. Washington's training and experience were primarily in frontier warfare involving small numbers of soldiers. He wasn't trained in an open field style of battle practiced by the commanding British general. He also had no practical experience maneuvering large formations in infantry, commanding cavalry and artillery, or maintaining the flow of supplies for thousands of men in the field. But he was courage and determined to smart enough to keep one step ahead of the enemy. Washington and his small army did taste victory early March of 1776 by placing artillery above Boston on Dorchester Heights, forcing the British to withdraw. Washington moved his troops into New York City, but in June, a new British commander, Sir William Howe, arrived at the colonies with a large expeditionary force Britain had deployed to date. And here is Washington with his men crossing the Delaware River. Okay, crossing the Delaware in August 1776, the British Army launched an attack and quickly took New York City in the largest battle of the war. Washington's army was routed and suffered the surrender of 2,800 men. He ordered the remains of his army to retreat into Pennsylvania across the Delaware River. Confident the war would be over in a few months, General Howe wintered his troops at Trenton and Princeton, leaving Washington free to attack at the time of the place of his choosing. On Christmas night of 1776, Washington and his men returned across the Delaware River and attacked unsuspecting Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, forcing their surrender. A few days later, invaded a force that had been sent to destroy his army. Washington attacked the British again, this at Princeton, dealing them in humiliating losses. Victories and losses. General Howe's strategy was to capture colonial cities and stop the rebellion at key economics and political centers. He never abandoned the belief that once the Americans were deprived of their major cities, the rebellions would wither. In the summer of 1777, he mounted an offensive against Philadelphia. Washington moved in his army to defend the city, but was defeated at the Battle of Brandywine. Philadelphia fell 2 weeks later. In the late summer of 1777, the British Army sent a major force under the command of John Burgoyne south of Quebec at Saratoga, New York, to split the rebellions between New England and southern colonies. But the strategy backfired as Burgoyne became trapped by the American armies led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga. Without support from Howe, who couldn't reach him in the tide, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his 6,200 men army. The victory was a major turning point in the war as it encouraged France to openly ally itself with the American cause for independence. Through all of this, Washington discovered an important lesson. The political nature of war was just as important as the military one. Washington began to understand the military victories were as important as keeping the resistance alive. Americans began to believe that they could meet their objective of independence without defeating the British Army. Meanwhile, British General Howe clung to the strategy of capturing colonial cities in hopes of smothering the rebellion. Howe didn't realize the capturing cities like Philadelphia and New York would not unseat colonial power. The Congress would just pack up and meet elsewhere. Go ahead, cut it. Washington Presidency. Still hoping to retire to his beloved Mount Vernon, Washington was once again called upon to service this country. During the presidential election of 1789, he received a vote from every elector to Electoral College, the only president in American history to be elected by unanimous approval. He took the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City, the capital of the United States at the time. As the first president, Washington was aware that his presidency would set a precedent for all that would follow. He carefully attended to the responsibility and duties of his office, remaining vigilant to not any European royal courts. To the end, he preferred the title Mr. President instead of more imposing names that were suggested. At first, he declined the $25,000 salary Congress offered the office of the presidency, for he was already wealthy and wanted to protect the image of selfless public servants. Congress persuaded him to accept the composition to avoid giving the impression that only wealthy men could serve as president. Washington proved to be an able administrator. He surrounded himself with some of the most capable people in the country, appointing Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of the State. He delegated authority wisely and consulted regularly with his cabinet, listening to their advice before making a decision. Washington established broad-ranging presidential authority, but always with the highest integrity, exercising power with the restraint of honesty. In doing so, he set a standard rare met by his successors, but wanted to establish an ideal by which all are judged. Accomplishments. During the first term, Washington adopted a series of measures proposed by Treasury Secretary Hamilton to reduce the nation's debt and place its finances on the sound foot. His administration also established several peace treaties with Native American tribes and approved a bill establishing the nation's capital and the permanent district along the Potomac River. Whiskey Rebellion. Then in 1891, Washington signed a bill authorizing Congress to place a tax on distilled spirits, which stirred protests in rural areas of Pennsylvania. Quickly, the protest turned into a full-scale federal law known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington invoked the Military Act of 1792, summoning local militias from several states to put down rebellion. Washington personally took command, marching the troops into the area of rebellion and demonstrating that the federal government would use force when necessary to enforce the law. This was also the only time a sitting U.S. president had led troops into battle. The Jay Treaty. In foreign affairs, Washington took the cautious approach, realizing that the weak young nation could not succumb to Europe. political intrigues. In 1793, France and Great Britain were once again at war. At his urging of Hamilton, Washington discarded the U.S. alliance with France and pursued a course of neutrality. In 1794, he sent John Jay to Britain to negotiate a treaty known as the Jay Treaty to secure a peace with Britain and clear up some issues held over from the Revolutionary War. The action infuriated Jefferson, who supported the French and felt that the U.S. needed to honor its treaty obligation. Washington was able to mobilize public support for the treaty, which proved decisive in securing ratification and in the Senate. Through the controversial, the treaty provided beneficial to the United States by removing British forts along the western frontier, establishing clear boundaries between Canada and the United States, and most important, delaying a war between Britain and providing over a decade of prosperous trade and development the fledgling country so desperately needed. Okay. And let me, okay. So then Washington goes into retirement, desiring to return to Mount Vernon and his farming, and feeling the decline of his physical power with age. Washington refused to yield to the pressure and to serve a third term, even though he would probably not have faced any opposition. By doing this, he was again mindful of the precedence of being the first president and chose to establish a peaceful transition of government. Farewell address. In the last months of his presidency, Washington felt he needed to give his country one last measure of himself. With the help of Hamilton, he composed a farewell address to the American people, which urges his fellow citizens to cherish the Union and avoid partisanship and permanent foreign alliances. In March 1797, he turned over the government to John Adams and returned to Mount Vernon, determined to live the last years as a simple gentleman farmer. His last official act was to pardon the participants in the Whiskey Rebellion. Upon returning to Mount Vernon in 1797, Washington felt to reflect sense of relief and accomplishment. He had left the government in capable hands, at peace, its debts well managed, and set on a course of prosperity. He devoted much of his time to tending the farm's operations and management. Although he was persuasive to be wealthy, his land holdings were only marginal profitable. His death. On a cold December day of 1799, Washington spent much of it inspecting the farm on horseback in a driving, His death. On a cold December day in 1799, Washington spent much of his inspecting the farm on horseback in a driving snowstorm. When he returned home, he hastily ate his supper in his wet clothes and then went to bed. The next morning, on December 13th, he awoke with a severe sore throat and became increasingly hoarse. He retired early, but awoke around 3 a.m. and told Martha that he felt very sick. The illness progressed until he died late in the evening of December 14, 1799. The news of Washington's death at the age of 67 spread throughout the country, plunging the nation into a deep mourning. Many towns and cities held mock funerals and presented hundreds of eulogies to honor their fallen hero. When the news of his death reached Europe, the British fleet paid tribute to his memory, and Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning. And then here we go. when he was at his deathbed. He has his wife at his side. The legacy. Washington could have been a king. Instead, he chose to be a citizen. He set many precedents for the national government and the presidency. The two-term limit in office, only broke once by Franklin D. Roosevelt, was later installed in the Constitution 22nd Amendment. He crystallized the power of the presidency as the part of the government, three branch of governments, able to exercise authority when necessary, but also accept the check and balances of power inherited in the system. He was not only considered a military and revolutionary hero, but a man of great personal integrity, with a deep sense of duty, honor, and patriotism. For over 200 years, Washington has been acclaimed as indispensable to the success of the revolution and the birth of the nation. But his most important legacy may be that he insisted he was dispensable, asserting that the causing of liberty was larger than any single individual. And there's George Washington, our first president of the United States. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Stay safe out there. Stay 6 feet apart and wash your hands. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.